Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Wall, an assistant professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And thank you all for attending the Culture in Contemporary Life Talk series. This series is an initiative of the Culture section of the American Sociological Association. And the purpose of the series is to explore the pressing social issues of our time through a cultural lens and to examine how cultural sociology can inform these issues. So we're having panels throughout the academic year, and each panel will be a discussion among several speakers and a moderator, all of whom are experts in this area. The discussion will be followed by a Q&A, and to participate in the Q&A, please put your questions in the chat at any time during or after the discussion. So this session, of course, is on creative industries in crisis, and I'll turn it over now to Rachel Skaggs, who's an assistant professor of arts management at Ohio State University. Rachel will be our moderator, and she can introduce the panelists and get our discussion started. So thank you very much, Rachel.
Great, thanks, Hannah. And thank you to the Culture section for organizing and hosting this timely conversation. Before we get into characterizing the intersecting crises that are affecting the creative industries at this time, I want to briefly introduce our three panelists. They're each highly accomplished in this area, and I think that their answers to today's questions will really illuminate their broad areas of expertise beyond these brief biographies. So Patricia A. Banks is the co-editor-in-chief of Poetics and professor of sociology at Mount Holyoke College. Her research focuses on culture, consumption, and inequality. Stephen J. Tepper is the dean and director of the Herberger Institute for Design and the Arts and foundation professor at Arizona State University. His writing and speaking is influential in the US cultural policy sphere, and his sociological research has focused on a broad array of topics, including cultural engagement, creative work, and careers in the arts. Angèle Christin is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at Stanford University, and her research examines how algorithms and analytics transform professional values, expertise, and work practices. And each of them are working on other projects that I'm sure we will also get into today, but let's get to the topic at hand. So for each of the three of you, I'd love for you to answer this opening question, probably starting with Patricia and going in the order of your biographies. So from your vantage point, what pressing crisis do you see affecting the creative industries? What are the indicators that show us the contours of this crisis?
Right. Well, thank you. First, I just want to thank Hannah for helping to organize it, and thank you, Rachel, for moderating. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. So, my research, as you shared, Rachel, really focuses on racial and ethnic inequality. And I think that racial and ethnic inequality is one of the most salient issues that is facing the cultural sector right now. In particular, from the research that I've done, we can see racial inequality that's related to cultural philanthropy, as well as cultural institutions. And there are several indicators that we can point to see this inequality. For example, one being rather low representation of racial and ethnic minorities on the boards of cultural institutions. Another being the long history of majority cultural institutions not showcasing the work of racial and ethnic minorities. And then we can also point to funding inequalities that exist between majority cultural institutions and ethno-racial minority cultural institutions. These inequalities are produced and reinforced by a variety of factors. They're related to, for example, racial, class, and other forms of inequality more broadly. When it comes to, for example, the issue of trusteeship. So why do we see rather low representation of racial and ethnic minorities on majority cultural institutions boards? Partly it has to do with wealth inequality. So when we're trying to explain these inequalities, we need to look at issues related to race, but then we also have to go beyond that to look at issues related to class and other forms of inequality.
So I guess I'll go next. If we go in kind of alphabetical order. So hi, first of all, it's such a pleasure to be here and, just to be with culture people. It just makes me really happy. And so thank you so much for organizing this and inviting me today. So I've been looking at two kind of sets of cultural producers, I guess. The first one is journalists and looking at the transformations of journalism with digital technologies. And the second one, which is a project that I'm working on right now, is about influencers and how influencers are kind of becoming a new kind of category of cultural and media producers that, kind of resembles journalists in some respects and are very different from journalists in other respects. And so for the question about the crisis, I'll focus on the journalism case because influencers feel like there is no crisis. Actually, they're having the best time of their life. So just like, everyone's stuck at home, looking at their screens. That's wonderful. I'm having an amazing time. And my audience kind of metrics are like through the roof. So, having just the best time. For journalists, I think that the crisis, so first, journalism has been talking about a crisis for now 30 years, right? So this is not new in any kind of way, but it has certainly become even more acute, if that's even possible, over the past 10, 15 years. And it's really a double crisis. It's an economic crisis, and it's a crisis of legitimacy. So on the economic side, obviously, with the development of digital technologies and the kind of rise of social media platforms, the revenue core of news organizations has been really kind of, shall we say, kind of chunked out like one bit at a time over the past 30 years, first with kind of classified ads, then with advertising revenue more generally, then with subscriptions. And so you've seen news organizations trying to kind of deal with that, basically, cutting down of their revenues in different ways. First, they try to really get into the chase for clicks and try to make money through advertising revenues. That turned out to be both necessary but not sufficient. And so most of the kind of traffic maximization websites have kind of not succeeded. And here I'm thinking about BuzzFeed, the Huffington Post, Upworthy, all of these kind of traffic kind of machines. It hasn't been quite enough. Another kind of way of dealing with kind of revenue changes has been to really encourage subscriptions and work on the brands of the news organizations. That's what the New York Times has been doing, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, etc. And a third kind of source of revenues has been kind of donations and kind of turning to nonprofit sources of revenues as a way to kind of compensate for the revenue loss of the other things. So there is this obvious kind of economic kind of side to the crisis, right? But then there is also a much more kind of legitimacy kind of oriented type of crisis that's going on, which is that a lot of people have lost trust in, the mainstream media. Now, the mainstream media obviously refers to, a specific kind of discourse on the right and the far right, but also increasingly on the left for kind of young readers, for a wide range of the population that's basically not recognizing themselves in mainstream media coverage. And that, I think, kind of overlaps with what Patricia was talking about, that some of this has to do with the ways in which mainstream media has been covering racial inequalities, racial justice, questions of gender, of different types of oppressions, and that they've been kind of they've had trouble adjusting to kind of changes in the ways in which people think about all of these questions. And so I think that what we're seeing right now is basically news organization trying to change the way in which they cover a lot of these kind of social justice questions and developing different strategies for doing so, but with different types of constraints. So perhaps I'll stop here for now.
And Stephen.
Great, thank you. Good to be here. Good to see my fellow panelists. I guess the most immediate crisis is just that artists are unbelievably underemployed and unemployed. Unemployment rates anywhere from 25 to 50% depending on the sector. Gigs have dried up. Cultural institutions on average have laid off about half of their workforce. They're burning through their reserves. Most cultural institutions have about 3 months of cash on hand, and many of them have burned through that and are running running deficits. So that's kind of the immediate crisis. So I think we can talk later about whether cultural institutions and or full employment should be the measure of cultural health. I'm not sure that's where we should be looking, but that'll be for a later part of the conversation. But I think there are three other crises. There's the crisis of access. So as cultural presentation moves online during the pandemic, and a lot of that will continue, we still have to remember that internet access really only connects with about 50% of the global population for the kind of material that is circulating. People don't have access to high-speed internet. And so that's a problem. That's a crisis of access. I think there's a crisis of polarization that has been exacerbated by the pandemic, but also by the current conditions of our politics. So about 80% of registered Republicans think universities have no value. They don't think much more highly of other cultural institutions like the press and or museums, performing arts organizations. And so I wonder about the ability for stories to cross divides. I think culture, to be healthy, needs to be able to cross all kinds of political, racial, class divides, and I'm not sure that our current moment of polarization is allowing culture to move that way, and that's important for democracy. And then to Patricia's point and Helg's point, the crisis of representation, just exacerbated by the pandemic. Who can afford to work for free? Who can afford to take an internship? Who can stay in the game long enough to get recognized or build an audience? And so if we already have significant underrepresentation of diverse voices and underrepresented BIPOC creatives, that's going to get worse in the near future, as many people can't afford to continue that kind of gig work and can't afford to do work for free.
Absolutely. And I think that these are three perspectives that show us that not only are there crises of representation, of legitimacy, and of meaning within the culture industries, but some real crises of the industry itself, based not only in the pandemic, but in some kind of long-standing and entrenched structural problems. So for our next question or two, I think that we have specific and maybe more acute challenges that are coming from this era. So the first one I'd like to touch on is the issue of racial inequality in America. So it's been squarely in the public consciousness increasingly over the past year, between ongoing acts of police violence against the Black community and a steady incline in racist violence toward Asian Americans that's kind of come to a head in the last month or two. So how have the creative industries, cultural institutions, and creatives or artists themselves responded to this piece of the crisis?
Sure, I'll start. So they've responded in so many ways. There's so many ways. So I'll just highlight a couple, and then we can always talk more a little bit later. But I'll kind of first start with the issue of philanthropy. So one of the real focuses of my research has been putting a spotlight on how cultural philanthropy is related to race and ethnicity. And so one of the interesting developments that has taken place is you've seen African-American trustees who are on majority museum boards organize. And so last fall, they organized the Black Trustee Alliance. And so this is a group that is going to be addressing a range of inequality that they see in the cultural world. For example, staffing and leadership, exhibitions, even vendors and contractors. And so I think that's one of the really interesting developments is you're seeing these Black trustees who are often one or just one of a couple of other African Americans on majority cultural institution boards join together and mobilize. So mobilization is certainly one of the responses that we've seen. At the same time, with cultural institutions themselves in the midst of the uprisings last summer that really started in May and June, what we saw was that cultural institutions were responding by making statements. And so, you know, the book project I'm working on now, Black Culture Inc., How Cultural Patronage Pays for Business, which is under contract with Stanford University Press. That's a book that's looking at how corporations, their engagement with cultural patronage. But one of the things that we saw in that moment was that Fortune 500 companies and other corporations were making these statements saying that they stand with people who are seeking racial equality. And it's interesting because you saw cultural institutions do the same. So when we look at major cultural institutions, museums such as the Smithsonian Institution, the Getty, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, many of them made statements as well saying that they are with people who are seeking racial equality. At the same time, and again, this is something we can talk a little bit about later, they made these statements, but then there was also a response. And so some stakeholders felt that those statements weren't enough and they were being pushed to go further. But I'll stop there, but there's a lot we can talk about there.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that what's fascinating is that from my angle, which is really looking a lot at social media right now, I see the same kind of decoupling, right, between like official kind of PR friendly statements about racial justice and then kind of pushback and backlash from like communities of color saying like, listen, this is not enough, like, and this is not cutting it, right? And so here, perhaps I'll talk a tiny bit more about my project on influencers, in which, you know, so the thing with influencers is that, so influencers are basically people who are making or seeking to make a living from their social media production, right? So compared to journalists or other kind of media producers, they're like unbundled in a way, right? They don't have an organization that kind of funnels the kind of content production. The only interlocutor that they have is a platform. So YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, you name it, but that's kind of what's happening. And so I think that what's interesting there is that you see much more diverse voices just by the kind of nature of that type of cultural field, right? And so what you see, and so I've been doing a lot of kind of interviews and observations with different kind of groups of influencers, including beauty influencers and including Black beauty influencers. And so what you see there is really interesting, that like there has been a lot of pushback against especially large beauty and makeup companies' statements about racial justice, right? So like all the big beauty companies have released statements saying that, you know, Black Lives Matter, that, you know, they're against police violence, that, you know, releasing the kind of square, like the black squares, and then saying that they're against, like, you know, that you have to stop Asian hate, etc. But then a lot of the work that Black beauty influencers have been doing is actually saying, like, listen, this is not enough. You're like putting all of these kind of social media friendly statements, but then you're not diversifying your workforce, you're not diversifying your kind of top administration, you're not diversifying your beauty products, right? So it's like a lot of these, especially major beauty brands and makeup brands still have, shall we say, palettes and kind of makeup kind of offerings that are mostly designed for white faces, right, and white skins. And so I think there has been, I mean, again, this is beauty, right? But beauty is a very serious case of cultural production, actually. And so there has been kind of a lot of pushback, which I think you find across the board for meaningful change. And I think that from a sociological perspective, I tend to think of it as like kind of calling out the decoupling, right? That, you know, big corporations are just like, they don't want to be on the kind of, they don't want to be seen as the bad guys, but they also don't really want to make the concrete efforts of like kind of diversifying internally, nurturing more diverse kind of sets of employees from inside. And it's the same in journalism, right? And so then they face this kind of like public backlash, especially from communities of colors online, and drawing on kind of forms of call out about culture, or what's called, for better or for worse sometimes, cancel culture, which has a long history in kind of Black communities online. And here I'm referring to the work of Andre Brock and Meredith Clark that show really well how Black Twitter, for example, comes with specific forms of expressions that are extremely politically involved and that kind of have a way of kind of voicing these types of political concerns that didn't find avenues of expression in the mainstream media, in part because of the crisis of representation and legitimacy we talked about. So I find that the current moment is really this kind of interesting tension between institutional actors and kind of distributed online collectives about the question of social, racial, and gender justice, right? And so I think it's just a very interesting and promising moment in many different ways.
Great. So I think as we've heard already, we've got positions, and cultural organizations have taken positions. Some of them have moved towards programs, and very few of them have moved towards power redistribution. So positions are all the statements we've seen, very thin. Often there's no accountability measure for those statements. Programs are, well, we're going to be presenting more BIPOC artists on our stages or in our galleries or studios or museum walls. That's important, but that's not enough. Enough would be changing the power of decision making. And I'll just give one example. One of our faculty members here, Daniel Bernard Romain, who's a Haitian composer, Haitian American composer, was commissioned by the Tulsa Opera to write an operetta on the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre. And so he wrote a piece, and the last two lines of the piece were, God bless America, God damn America. And they said, well, we have some ideas for that last sentence. Why don't you say, God bless America, or, God save America, or something. And he said no. And they paid him out, but they didn't present his work. And there's a big, media uproar about that, and lots of social media conversation. But his point was, and there was some conflict between him and the singer, who's a Black woman who didn't want to say those words. But the point was that it should have been a BIPOC creative director who was organizing and curating that program and making those decisions and facilitating the interaction among artists. It should not have been the white artistic director of that organization. And so I think a question is, what would it look like to open source our institutions, right? That we've built these magnificent cultural institutions, but we've restricted the decision-making power to largely largely white people. And our boards, as Patricia knows, is largely filled with white, wealthy people who influence those decisions. But what would it look like if half or 3/4 of those seasons were the facilities and the talent and the technical staff were available to the community to program and to determine the content, to really shift the power? And that's not a step most of our cultural institutions are willing to take. But that's what true equity and inclusion and a differential approach to power would look like, but it's a bridge too far for most.
I wonder, hearing all of your responses to this, within the kind of culture, literature, especially in creative industries, we think about gatekeepers quite a bit. And so it seems like implicit in a lot of what you all are saying, museum boards, platforms, universities, and organizations, gatekeepers are there facilitating or inhibiting what kind of creative production happens. So to what degree do you all believe that gatekeepers have a say in the responses to the crises that we're facing in the creative industries?
Yeah, it's a very interesting thread that runs through all of the comments that we've made so far. So, I think what's interesting about the issue of gatekeepers is how the gatekeepers are changing. So, my book, Diversity and Philanthropy to African American Museums, which is my second book, that's an ethnographic study of people who support African-American museums. So I went across the country and interviewed over 80 supporters of African-American museums across the country. And one of the points that I make in the book is that we really need to think about cultural patrons as a diverse group. Typically, we think about them purely in terms of their social class. So they are upper middle, they're upper class. But what I argue is that we really do need to take into account other aspects of their identity, for example, their race and ethnicity. And what happens is that when it comes to trusteeship, for example, trustees from different racial and ethnic groups do, in some cases, bring a different set of values and perspectives to their leadership. So I think that's one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that, different types of gatekeepers based on their background can have a different set of values. So the implications of that can look very different if we see them changing.
Yeah. So definitely the transformation of gatekeeping is a big part of the story when you look at social media platforms, right? So what's interesting with social media platforms is that they have this kind of democratizing discourse. Anyone, broadcast yourself, right? Anyone can become an influencer. It's like this kind of radical kind of democratizing discourse that digital technologies coming from Silicon Valley and other places often come with. And so certainly when you look at the case of influencers, and especially compared to journalists, right? Knowing that journalism is this kind of, well, it's a semi-profession, right? So there is like a clear kind of pathway. And as you see across this kind of pathway, there is a typical kind of elite whitening of the situations that Stephen had been talking about, which is that you need to have the right kind of both kind of social background and family resources to do all the unpaid internships and then the kind of freelance work in order to get a super low paid kind of position in a newsroom that then will perhaps turn into a slightly better paid, all of this being in usually large cities. And here I'm talking about a specific type of urban media, right? I mean, local news is a bit different, but this like comes obviously, this kind of gatekeeping that comes with professionalization kind of reinforces shall we say, social and racial hierarchies within newsrooms. Very different for influencers. You can be an influencer from your living room in the middle of wherever you live, right? And that's something that influencers, when I do my interviews, talk a lot about. They were like, listen, I was very isolated. So let's say, for example, I've been doing this study about vegan influencers. All of them turned to veganism. They were living, everywhere across the world. And they were like, well, no one in my town was vegan. And so I turned to YouTube to kind of find like-minded people who wanted to share vegan tips and recipes. And then I created my YouTube channel. And then next thing you know, I started making $5,000 a month. And then next thing you know, I quit my day job. And now I've turned it into a kind of small business where I sell like cookware and cookbooks and do all of these things and these diets for people who want to turn to vegan diets, right? So anyway, so you see definitely this kind of how platforms, the absence of obvious gatekeepers kind of leads to some form of democratization of kind of cultural and media production. That said, when you start talking to influencers and to people who spend a lot of time online, you realize that there are new gatekeepers, and these gatekeepers are typically algorithmic gatekeepers, right? So a lot of what influencers talk about, well, a couple of things. The first thing they talk about is that the kind of curation algorithms that social media platforms use are very opaque, unaccountable, and rapidly changing, constantly changing, which means that influencers and online creators are always trying to like guess what the algorithm is going to make visible, right? And they have a lot of complaints about it. For example, one of their major complaints is about demonetization algorithms that are basically these algorithms on YouTube especially, but also on Instagram and on TikTok that remove the advertising revenues for videos that are deemed to go against community guidelines or to not be advertising friendly. Now, turns out that these kind of algorithms learn from past data and tend to be discriminatory in a variety of ways. For For example, they tend to remove every kind of video associated with trans topics, right? With a lot of them with especially Black women kind of videos. So you know, obviously the algorithms are still enforcing kind of forms of discrimination, but because they're automated procedure, because YouTube and Instagram operate at scale with billions of users, it's very hard to contest these algorithmic decisions, and it's very hard to make your voice heard when you feel that your content is being demonetized or buried kind of low on the platform by these computational procedures. So you see these kind of changes in the kind of gatekeeping that takes place. And these transformations enable kind of new winners and also new, perhaps not that new, shall we say, different forms of oppression or exclusion that are perhaps a bit less visible and a bit less accountable, and for that reason, kind of harder to fix in many ways. So that's definitely kind of what I see in the case of influencers.
I wonder if it would be helpful to maybe differentiate between gatekeepers around consumption and gatekeepers around production. So in YouTube and TikTok, where the cost of production is really low, the power is sort of around those influencers who can call attention to things. So that's really, I would say, a democratization of the gatekeepers who control the larger patterns of consumption and where our attention is spent. But you know, Netflix spent $15 billion last year on content production. And so there's still a lot of money being spent on high production storytelling and creative work. You know, I think 5% of studio executives are non-white. So those gatekeepers haven't changed so fast. And there's a lot of money and a lot of resource there that's being controlled by way too few people. So yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful to think about those two different places in which gates are controlling production and consumption and attention.
Yeah, I think this thread of kind of democratized but opaque is another kind of thread that maybe we can pull on, because there's a sense that maybe more people being involved in the creative industries is a good thing. But maybe, Stephen, we could start with you, and I'd like to get you all to talk about, are we trying to optimize the number of full-time artists and creators? Like, is that what we're trying to do to make a healthy or equitable cultural ecology?
Yeah, no, I think we are thinking about the wrong things. I think we have sort of a knee-jerk response to cultural institutions. I think we see them as fragile. We all, you know, we have for a long time, and that their rise and fall, their preservation is critical to the cultural ecology. Don't get me wrong, there are lots of people who make their living connected and presenting in those cultural nonprofits in particular. But you know, there's a lot of other ways in which culture gets exchanged and shared, and where it has resonance and has meaning. And I don't think the cultural sector has ever done a good job of saying what is wrong, what is the problem, other than lack of resource. I think now when we're talking about equity and inclusion, we have a different lens, but that really shouldn't be restricted to cultural institutions or even professional artists. We don't measure the health or the vibrancy of our health sector by whether nurses, doctors, and physical therapists are fully employed, right? That's not the measure. And I'm not sure why full-time employment for artists is the measure of whether our cultural sector and our cultural ecology is healthy. What are the things that signal vibrancy? The diversity of expression, its resonance. Are people sharing it with each other? The variety of cultural forms, the preservation of cultural forms, the access to rewards of whether that's attention or resources. But it doesn't mean that, I don't know if we know that full-time employment in the arts is what will lead to the most vital cultural sector. It may, but no, we've never done that. I don't know whether the quality of art is worse now than it was when we had a lot more full-time artists. I think any worker should have basic access to guaranteed income and health and other human services, but that's a question about work. It's not a question about artistic work. So I guess my feeling is that we focus on things we can measure, like unemployment or underemployment. We obsess about the idea that artists should have stable full-time lives, and that it's professional artists more than amateur artists that we should be supporting. Manje suggests that that's never going to be the case. There's always going to be an oversupply of artists. There's always going to be depressed wages, and there's a lot of reasons for that. So optimizing on sort of full employment for artists seems an odd way to try to maximize our culture. I think we should look at, really analyze, assess what makes a vibrant culture, and then work towards that, rather than assume it's the health of cultural institutions and their bottom line, or the presence of full-time artists.
I'm happy to go next, because actually, I very much agree that I find it interesting how in the cultural industries the debate is about full-time employment for artists, and it just always struck me as like, wait, why is that a thing? But then, okay, so I completely agree with what Stephen was saying, but then so this is a bit of a tangent, right? But looking at influencers, what's fascinating is that obviously none of them is, full-time employment doesn't even begin to map onto the kind of lived experiences of influencers, right? They're just doing a zillion different things. Usually they're kind of, the way they describe it is like hustling, right? They're just hustling on the different platforms, switching from platform to platform. Usually they still have a day job. When they stop their day jobs, they kind of do it part-time, then they do different business ventures, they post content. It's so fragmented and distributed, right? What I find interesting is that because they live and die on the platform economically, that's where their audience comes from, that's where their subscribers come from, that's where their fame comes from. It is very fickle. And it is very unstable, because so much of this depends on going viral, right? And kind of the algorithm kind of, for some reason, are promoting your content, etc. Or at least that's what they feel like. That's something that I've noticed by looking at several groups or fields of influencers, is that over time, as this begins to be their primary source of revenues, they tend to produce more extreme and inflammatory content. And the reason for that is because that's what gets you views, right? And when you need the views, when you need the subscribers, when you need the traffic for your revenues, when you don't have any, that basically you just need that you have no security except for these views. It tends to kind of create specific traffic-driven incentives. And, without going kind of all Bourdieu on that, it's pretty clear that there is kind of a shift towards more problematic forms of content production over time. And so that makes me wonder if instead of full-time employment, we may not think of a form of security. And, obviously I'm French, and in France, there are all of these subsidies for creators, intermittents du spectacle, who if they kind of log in a certain number of hours in the year before, they get kind of subsidies for the year after. And looking at influencers, I feel that the kind of hustle, the fickleness, the kind of instability and the precarity really of the kind of living and dying on the platform maybe, and I know this will never happen in the US, right? I'm realistic, but I'm just wondering if the debate instead of full-time employment is more about security, or some form of security that may, shall we say, remove some of the daily pressures to get traffic, to get attention, to get etc. That then can lead to problematic information that then can fuel polarization, disinformation, fake news, you name it.
And so what I'd like to add is that I do think it is helpful to, when we think about the health of the cultural sector, to move the conversation beyond cultural institutions. But I also think we do need to, particularly when it comes to particular areas, I think cultural institutions are particularly important. So for example, much of my work has been on visual art. And when it comes to visual art, museums are so important. So museums play a very, very important role. So when we start to think about the health of that kind of subsector, I do think we need to be attentive to cultural organization. So I do think it is important for us to be attentive to that. And that said, so then what does a healthy cultural sector look like when we are being attentive to cultural organizations? And I think it means one that where we have diverse cultural organizations thriving. So for example, when it comes to the museum sector, a healthy museum sector is a museum sector where African-American museums, such as the Studio Museum in Harlem, the National Museum of African-American History and Culture, where those institutions are thriving. So I do think it is important that we are attentive to, particularly when it comes to some sectors, that we are attentive to organizations. I also want to say, when we start to think at this through the lens of organizations, we can see how important they are for artists. So for example, when it comes to African-American visual artists, historically, it was African-American cultural institutions who really were at the center of collecting their work. So for example, the historically Black colleges and universities and their museums, that they were collecting work by some of these artists when majority museums weren't. So I do think it's important for us to be sensitive to the fact that cultural organizations do matter when it comes to the health of particular sectors, and in particular having diverse organizations.
Rachel, can I ask Patricia a question about the ultimate goal of the institutions? So for museums, so right now museums are power brokers, so they're important. But could you imagine, and you might make an argument that it's about the storage and preservation of work, and so you need museums to do that, and that's part of what we would be measuring for cultural vitality is work getting preserved and handed down. Then we might say, are museums the best organizations to do that? But the goal is really the preservation and the handing from generation to generation. If it's about the presentation of work, we may argue whether museums are the best way to get work presented. There's I guess it's still a cultural institution, but the museum in Baltimore that doesn't have a building, and they present material in all kinds of different spaces across the community. And perhaps arguably, if the goal is for people to have access to art, then not having a cultural organization with a facility might actually be better for that particular metric of what we think cultural vitality is. So I'm wondering, is it the museum itself, or is it that the museum currently serves a certain really powerful purpose, but other things could if we thought about the actual objectives of cultural vitality differently? I'm just wondering how important the museum is versus the other goals that you might have for visual art.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting question. And I would almost, probably don't have time to get into this too extensively. I would almost think that perhaps with other art forms, cultural institutions would be less important. So I think certainly you're correct that perhaps we have to consider what are we asking the art to do, and buildings may be more or less important depending what we want the art to do. But in some cases, with visual works of art, it is very difficult to move them across different spaces. We have climate control issues. Sometimes the works are incredibly large, and so even when it comes to exhibiting works, some works just aren't their best shown in an environment where it can be kept safe in some ways, that the object itself is safe. So I think you're correct, absolutely, that part of the importance of institutions depends on what we want the work to be doing. But at the same time, there are certain works of art and then also just certain art forms where I think cultural institutions may be more or less important. I also have to say too, I mean, I think one of the things we have to think too about kind of changing the game a little bit about things is that we have some artists who still have not been able to be collected, to be exhibited when it comes to visual artists by museums. And so I think that still matters to a certain degree. You know, part of what we want to do is we want to change the system, but in terms of those really important markers, you know, having an exhibition in particular types of museums, that there are certain artists who historically really have been left outside of that. And so I think the institutions matter in that sense as well.
Great. I'm glad to have, I mean, I think that we could go on for so much time on all of these issues, and this just shows, kind of scrapes the surface on the diversity of art forms, of platforms, of all of the kind of spaces and people and institutions that complicate the study of culture industries, creative industries. So we'll go ahead and move into the Q&A time. And so if the audience has questions, please put them into the Q&A. We'll start with one from Dave O'Brien, who says that he agrees with everyone's pessimism and sense of disaster from the pandemic. Yes. But also it makes him wonder about the elements of creative destruction that we might see, creating new art forms and new movements with perhaps new and unexpected inequalities. Would you all like to comment on the potential for elements of creative destruction and what might come after these crises? Maybe we'll have Stephen go first on this one.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of innovation. I mean, you know, our symphony orchestra here laid off all their musicians and furloughed their staff. They were previously in a $2.5 million deficit. I'm sure they love that I'm talking about this publicly. And got enough COVID relief to kind of wipe out their deficit and start fresh. And so are they going to build the same kind of organization, which was not sustainable and it hasn't been for over a decade, or will they build something different? You know, they have experimented now with bringing musicians into people's living rooms, and that's a sort of a powerful, intimate way of engaging with art. Is there an economic model there? Uncertain yet. But, you know, I think there's no question that something new will emerge from that. But I love the second part of the question, which is, will there be new unexpected inequalities? And the answer is yes. I mean, there's no question that's how inequality works. And so how do we, as we're thinking about cultural policy, as foundations are thinking about which of these new forms are they going to invest in and which are they not, how do you have an equity lens for making those decisions? Because without that, there's no question that you're going to have all kinds of new forms. I mean, one new form is immersive media. I mean, we're here investing in, $100 million immersive media studio. And we think a lot of art is going to be experienced in extended reality. But what are the inequities of who controls that technology, who programs in that technology, and who has, and who has access to for the costs. And so, yeah, I think it's an exciting time, but without that lens, we could make investments and place bets on things that will have extreme inequitable outcomes.
Yeah, and Angèle, it seems like your work might give us some insight, right, to maybe the algorithmic basis of new inequalities.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's really interesting looking at influencers, and I think I may be one of the only people whose work has not been affected at all, whose ethnographic fieldwork has not been affected at all by the pandemic, because I was looking at influencers and I'm still looking at influencers, and everything takes place online, and so I'm doing all of these kind of digital ethnography online, virtual internships, virtual observations, all of the virtual interviews, like everything virtual. So it just means so much time in front of my screen. So looking at influencers, definitely creative destruction applies. The kind of destruction, dismantling, or whatever, incapacitation of the cultural sector over the past year and some has been a boon for influencers. All social media platforms see their kind of usage, kind of metrics go through the roof. Same with influencers, and same for brands who are now kind of really investing in what's called influencer marketing, which is basically kind of multi-level marketing, where like they kind of subcontract with lots of influencers for them to promote products like this, to their audiences and saying, I really like this, it's just really great. Like you guys should try it. Swipe up, and there will be a link that will lead you directly to the website of this company, and you get a 10% discount. And so you see definitely that this is turning now into a full-scale economic and cultural ecosystem of kind of influencer creation, social media platform, and brands relying on influencer marketing. Now, what's interesting, talking about different forms of inequality, is that obviously there is a kind of, on the platform side, kind of algorithmic mediation, algorithmic kind of content moderation, demonetization, curation algorithms, etc., that kind of have their own bias. But the other big bucket of inequality, I think, comes from brands who now are, relying on these influencer marketing campaigns to kind of touch customers, because screens are the main point of contact now. But what's been found is that, there is actually a lot of discrimination in how much they pay the influencers they work with. So as part of my new project, I'm doing this kind of computational analysis of 100,000, 1,600 posts where influencers of different kind of race and ethnicity share anonymously the rates that they've received for specific posts on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, and how much they've been paid for brands. And, we're in the middle of data collection and preliminary analysis, but what emerges is that, just from like kind of coding the data, is that there is a lot of people are really pissed at the fact that most brands are paying Black influencers and influencers of colors much less than white influencers, and especially the kind of blonde, thin, white woman on Instagram with similar metrics, so similar number of followers, same kind of posts, same kind of engagement rates. So anyway, so definitely new forms of inequalities that need to be kind of studied and mapped.
Great, thank you. We also have a question from Terry McDonnell, and I'll go ahead and ask Patricia to be maybe the first respondent to this one. So he asks, how do we restructure cultural institutions to encourage them to rethink distribution of access and power? He says he's thinking here of the Indianapolis Museum making the racist underpinnings of a job ad pretty public, saying they were, quote, seeking a director who would work not only to attract a more diverse audience, but to maintain its traditional core white audience. When cultural institutions view their survival as based on one probably white wealthy constituency, how do we dismantle that perceived dependency? What do we want to break of these cultural institutions, and what do we keep? So power to communities within this context.
Yeah, so I think one of the issues that we have to be sensitive to is the history. So this is not the first time that we're in a moment like this in the world of culture. So in the 1960s and the 1970s, artists as well as other stakeholders were protesting in front of museums like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Whitney, and MoMA, and they were protesting the lack of collections and exhibitions focused on African-American artists, women artists, and other racial and ethnic minority artists. And so with the pressure, there was some change, but then we fast forward to here we are in the 21st century, and we see that certainly things in terms of diversity don't look the way they did in 1950, but there's still a long way to go, which suggests that part of what institutions are responding to is direct pressure, and so I think that if the pressure continues, I think that we might expect for some of the changes, the promises that are being made to continue. But I think that if there is not pressure, it's not necessarily clear that they will continue on the path that they're on in this moment right now.
Angèle or Stephen, do you have a sense of ways that we move back to communities in the face of the kind of inequity and restructuring that needs to happen post-pandemic, post all of the crises we've talked about?
I mean, there are 120,000 nonprofit cultural institutions or somewhere around there. Every city, small, large, medium, has, museum, orchestra, theater, dance company. So there's a lot of organizations. I think the biggest and the best branded are going to change from the kind of public pressure that Patricia mentions. And some will do better than others. And some will never be able to really get free from the grips of their patrons. But there's a lot of other cultural organizations, and a lot of them, really are dependent on philanthropy, local foundations. And I think there's an opportunity to force some of these cultural institutions to change. And, again, I'm going to use you can pick our theater or our orchestra here in Phoenix. They're down to 0 performances. They're going to have to rebuild their staff. They're going to have to reimagine what their model is. Now, their model could be, 175 concerts that we're going to program for our community, every available night of the week. Or the foundations could put pressure and say, no, half of your space will be dedicated to community groups. Again, this open source of our institutions. And one of our graduates wrote and built a play on Che Guevara, and he rented a community center, and he had 5 nights of standing room only crowds of 350 a night. I am convinced that our communities could program powerful work that would also be economically viable, because it would be relevant and it would be resonant. And so I think there's 80,000 cultural institutions that could be pressured to open source their institutions to the community. But I do think it requires some policy work at the foundation level, so that there's some pressure for them to do that. Otherwise, they're going to try to rebuild institutions that were already struggling and not successful and not equitable.
Yeah, and perhaps adding a last word here and more on the question of journalism, which is a more established kind of set of institutions that could be reformed. I mean, I think that what's really interesting, and that echoes Terry's point, is that right now most news organizations are really stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I'm thinking, for example, of the New York Times, where right now, in fact, there is really 2 New York Times, at least, probably many more, right? But there is the kind of traditional New York Times that caters to the average New York Times reader, right? And that tends to be highly educated, mostly kind of coastal elites, very white, very male, and then there is, shall we say, social media kind of woke, New York Times that is much younger, much more digital heavy, more diverse, mostly because they're younger, and that programs in journalism, etc., and the pathways to journalism have opened up a tiny bit, and because there are a couple of editors that are really trying to diversify, and right now within the New York Times, basically you see a lot of conflicts and a lot of tensions, more recently with kind of several columnists and op-ed writers resigning or getting fired as part of these conflicts, right? And I think that some of this, in fact, like reflects imagined audiences, right? Or what the top editors at the New York Times think their audience wants. And obviously, depending on the editors, they're gonna imagine different kinds of audiences. And some of them will imagine more, and drawing on a ton of data, I should say, obviously. And here I'm referring in part to Caitlin Petrie's work on metrics, audience metrics at the New York Times. They just kind of see different things and they see different priorities and different future for the organization. And so I think that within kind of big kind of cultural and media organizations, this is definitely a site of tension, conflicts, and negotiations about what the future of cultural and media production is going to look like.
Right. Thank you. Sadly, we are out of our time, so I'm going to turn it back over to Hannah to introduce the next of these exciting panels.
Thank you so much, everyone, for this fascinating panel. And yes, stay tuned for our last Culture and Contemporary Life series panel of this academic year, which will be the cultural politics of naming and commemoration. This panel will be at 12 p.m. Pacific time, 3 p.m. Eastern time on May 27th. And the panelists will be Fiona Greenland, Christina Simcoe, and Angela Gonzalez, and we'll have the moderator, who will be Robin Wagner Pacifici. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and see you next time.